of where we're going. So last week I introduced this series called Chosen Family and Faithful Christian Community, and we looked at a passage out of Mark that really introduced the idea of chosen family, this phrase, as a means of recovering what I would call the radical idea of Christian community. It's this point where Jesus, early on in his ministry, he's surrounded by people that are responding to him faithfully. He's healed many of them. He's attracting them, and he declared that they were to him like family. They were his brother and his mother, and the people who wanted to do the will of God, that was his family. And that was even set vis-a-vis his own biological family. And so we talked a little bit about kind of what that would mean if we rethink Christian community as family. What does that imply to us about who is welcomed in and what our purpose is and how we behave and how we sustain that community in the face of a world that's often uninformed by the values of Christ. So that's our big theme. Today, we're going to look at 4 practices of the early church that guided its development. We'll see that in Acts 2. These are passages we often look to when we talk about Christian community. And then next week, the last week I'm with you, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I call 3 deep values that keep community on track. And it's kind of a more of an ethical approach to these underlying values that guide our community. Now, I didn't want to, before we dive into today's text, I just want to make one comment about the context of this study. So last week at the end of the study, Lester thanked Bill for the timeliness of the study, especially in light of some of the inclusion transitions that the UMC is going through. And I'm enormously grateful that the kind of this speaks to your situation. I've been there myself, and I do want to encourage you that it'll be okay. The sky's not falling, and your worst fears won't be confirmed. And in fact, you may very well live up to your highest values on the other side of this. But I did want to say I didn't create this study for that purpose. Actually, this study arose out of my own church's life. About a year ago, our pastor of 32 years retired. We've only had 5 pastors in the history of our church. So this is quite a watershed moment. I was on the search committee for a new pastor. Baptists, we don't get the benefit or whatever of having a bishop who sends us a pastor, but we go find one ourselves after kind of deeply studying what the congregation needs and where the opportunities before us. And so I'm a research analyst. Bill kind of suggested that I have some experience with technology and some of those things. So I'm a research analyst by profession these days. And so we did a big research project with our church that we called Everybody Speaks. And as the theme suggests, we wanted to hear from everybody in the church. And so one of the bottom line findings of that research study was that despite the fact that my church thinks very highly of itself, and we think we're great at everything, one of the things we learned is that there were some real gaps in community in our church. When we gave people a chance to speak up, there were people who said, I don't really feel cared for, or somebody didn't show up for me, or I think children sometimes are neglected in this way or that way, or I've been here for a while and I haven't developed deep friendships that I really need. And it kind of, and as I read those open-ended responses, I was really moved to recognize that no matter how healthy a church is, there are always community gaps. There are always people who don't feel connected, and sometimes the inner people in a church, the active people, they don't quite get it because the world you see is loving and wonderful and caring, and it's great. But when I think about people, I often call them who sit above the fold in the sanctuary. That is, they sit above the midway point toward the back. That oftentimes those people they're still hungry for community, and that we've just got to do a better job in leading people into community. Those of us who've been where the sausage is made in church life know that one of the number 1 reasons for people leaving church is because they don't have meaningful relationships. They'll put up with a lot. People will put up with a lot of disappointments in church life if they have good friends, people they've invested in, and people have invested in them. But in the absence of that, it's a tenuous relationship. And one of the things we've seen post-COVID in the United States is churches most of them lost 1/3 of their active participants, and they're still kind of clawing their way back. And this is across all denominations, there's a real need to rebuild community and to rethink. We created a Belong team, and programmatically we did some things out of all of that work. And we brought in a new pastor who thought was really equipped to help us lead in that effort. So that's just, I don't want you to understand that's the background. So I developed this material and I taught it around a bunch of classes in our church to really support this church-wide priority of rethinking community and kind of taking it down the road. So I want to start by asking you this morning, in your experience, how common is this experience of deep family-like community? And we'll talk more about what that looks like, but on a scale of 1 to 10, because I'm a researcher, right, with 1 being very uncommon and 10 being very common, what's your experience? How would you rate your lifetime experiences of finding community, deep community? Is it common, uncommon, in the middle? What would you say?
Brad, you might have to drop off to the side. You might, this is a hard class probably for that, because most of us in here connect in lots of ways throughout the week and the months and the years of our church life on various committees, various endeavors. Last night, we went to dinner and a movie with a couple of couples from the church, and so, but it's taken 25 years, and this class is, I think, to me, the epitome of a community, because lots of us in here have gone and sat at hospitals with each other. We've been at weddings, we've been at funerals together, and so I would probably rate us pretty high for this class.
Mm-hmm.
Now in the church as a whole, we're probably middle of the road at best.
Sure.
My opinion.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that's fair. I mean, your class strikes me a lot like my class in my church. They're the deacons, the leaders of the church. Most of them have been there a long time. Like, I joined the church 7 years ago, and I'm the new guy. I'm not a Mayflower member, as I jokingly call, the multi-generational families. So yeah, I appreciate that. So I would say your class has a lot to give in community to other people, perhaps, because you've cultivated this culture, which is a wonderful thing. And I'm not begging for a negative answer. I think if I think about my own life, I've seen community done really, really well, and it's a beautiful thing when it's done well. I've also seen community done really poorly, and almost like it wasn't even important. Like everything was a worship experience or some program, and the relationship building wasn't a part of it. And some of those churches I was a pastor of. So there you go, right? So I think many of us maybe have had a mixed bag, especially if you've moved around a bit and you haven't kind of been situated in one church for a long time. Well, let's dive into this. So we're going to look at Acts 2, 42 to 47 this morning. And as you're kind of finding that, and I'm going to ask somebody to read again like I did last week. There was a French Catholic priest named Alfred Loisy who famously wrote, "Jesus announced the kingdom, and it's the church that came." Now think about that for a second. He announced the kingdom, and it's the church that came. So when you think about it, Jesus did not come preaching the church. Jesus did not come preaching an institution. In fact, he didn't really even use the word church. The word church is used in Matthew once. We believe it's a later insertion probably into the gospel. But what he came preaching is he preached the kingdom of God, right? The kingdom of heaven is accessible to all of you. And it's here. And it's a kingdom of grace and healing and redemption and forgiveness and power and all of those things. But as he preached the kingdom of God and as he demonstrated the power of God in his signs and wonders, people were attracted and people were drawn to him. And it's the church that sprang up afterward. And that this church that we'll see was organically embodied the gospel. And when I say organically, I mean the very founding nature, shape, form, essence, values. It was the gospel embodied. And so that's really kind of what we're striving for, is how can our communities embody the gospel, be the gospel in such a way that we will have the same compelling effect on others around us in the way the church did. So, I mean, when you think about these early believers, right, just post-resurrection believers, what drove them into community, into the Christian community? Well, some experienced Jesus directly, right? They witnessed his grace, healing, miracles, all of that. Some people witnessed the crucifixion and the resurrection. Some people experienced Pentecost, which we just celebrated in the church year. Some were drawn into the community by preaching of the gospel by the apostles. And then some observed and experienced the emerging community of believers in kind of their daily interactions. So let's just dive in here. So Luke shows us throughout the book of Acts, he's the writer of Acts, right? These snapshots of the community of believers. There's one in Acts 2, Acts 4, Acts 5, as he's unpacking the narrative of Pentecost and the Holy Spirit's effect on the early believers. He gives us these short glimpses of what kind of a day in the life of was like. So this is one of the first ones, and we'll unpack this afterwards. So who would read Acts 2, 41 through 47?
All right, I'll read it.
Thank you.
Those who accepted his message were baptized, and about 3,000 were added to their number that day. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. The Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so let's take a first impression. And I'm sure these verses are familiar to you, and they're very straightforward and simple with enormously profound implications. But what's your first impression? What strikes you as unusual about this early community of believers?
They sold their property and possessions and shared the money with those in need.
Yes, yes. Their economic life was radically transformed from what we understand human nature to be. And I'll circle back to that a little bit later when I was in Cuba a number of years ago, studying the history mission work there. But yeah, I think us Americans, especially in our culture, it's a radical thing to consider, kind of the communal nature of property and caring for one another economically. For sure, we'll come back to that one. But anything else stand out to you?
You know, until I read that, Brad, that way, it mentions breaking bread twice. You know, those 5 verses. I don't know what that means, but it just stuck out. It just stuck out to me.
Yeah, yeah, there's a strong emphasis on that table fellowship together, and we'll talk about that as one of their practices that guided them.
I want to speak.
Their numbers grew.
Yeah, the nickels and noses, as we sometimes say. But
Don't necessarily show growth.
yeah, and yet it does show that God was moving on human hearts. And Peter could preach, and 3,000 people were converted. And that there was that people were coming in, they were getting saved, they were coming into relationship with God because their lives were changed. The numbers themselves don't mean that the people were growing, but we'll see by the transformed lives that they're living that a lot of them are growing. In fact, they're becoming different kind of people. Well, we'll press on, but there's, I think this snapshot of community, especially when you compare it to maybe present day church communities, this could be a challenging picture. I know I read this and I'm challenged. But we also realize that there is this social relational magnetism that was a part of this early community. You could say it was all the Holy Spirit, but it was the Holy Spirit working through faithful believers that allowed their lives to be transformed. And all that put together was very powerful and dynamic. And the church took off. So I want to talk about these 4 practices. Again, they seem pretty straightforward, but I think they have incredible implications. So the first thing that we see here is that it says that they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. Now, this word devoted, those of us who've been around religious life, for a long time, it's kind of a fluffy word, I think. I mean, we attach the word devoted or devotional or devotion to almost anything religious. We read devotionals that are inspirational writings. We have a devotion as a prayer experience, right? But I want to remind us that this word, the core meaning of this word is to continue to do something with intense effort, with the possible implication of despite difficulty. So when we're talking about these practices and people devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, they devoted themselves to the fellowship, they devoted themselves to the breaking of bread, they devoted themselves to prayer, that we are to understand this to mean that they applied themselves with intense effort and that they encountered difficulties, but they overcame those difficulties because of the importance of the practice. So from the very outset, we see that undergirding this Christian community that achieves a kind of family-like quality, it's not a casual consumerism, right? It's not religion as an interest or as a hobby. It's not, commitment when it's convenient. It is these practices, they're vitally important to the quality of life you will live and the quality of our fulfillment of God's mission in the world. And so the teaching, right? The teaching is one of the things we see that they applied themselves to. Now, what do you think it means when it says they applied themselves to the apostles' teaching? What do you think that content was? The latest top 10 Christian bestseller?
Overall, the group, they're talking to Jews.
Right?
And they're talking to people who've been raised Jewish their whole lives, and that's all they know.
Right.
Radically different. And so if you're gonna make this change and you're, more than a teenager, you probably have inbred thoughts and feelings and ways to do things, and this is completely different.
Yeah, great to point that out. These first believers, especially at the early point in Mark, these are almost all Jews, right? There's no Gentile acceptance yet. And while they were diverse in many ways, they were people that were immersed in Jewish culture and religion. And you're exactly right. The teaching of the apostles, first of all, if we look at Peter's public preaching, it's the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, right? Technically, we call this the kerygma. It is the proclamation of the gospel. It is who Jesus was, what Jesus did, what Jesus said, how Jesus treated people, the crucifixion and the reality of the crucifixion. And they were at just the very beginning of an understanding of the crucifixion and what it could possibly mean. And then the reality of the resurrection and the pronouncement of God's forgiveness and welcome and acceptance to all through Jesus. So there was a lot of unlearning of Jewish thought, and there was also a lot of fulfillment of Jewish thought, right? So we know, yeah, Bill, jump in here.
Something always amazed me with this idea of devotion to the apostles. When we've been on mission trips to places that don't have Bibles, people who just have to relate to the preacher, they starved to hear, what does Jesus say about this? What did Jesus do? They looked for anybody that could tell them a story that they heard from somebody who heard from Jesus. I got a feeling that one of the things that these people did, they didn't have the New Testament as we have it. As you said, they're basically people who come from some other religion. They're saying, look, I know what my Jewish rabbi said, and I know what my spiritual leader over here in the village said, but I want to know, what did Jesus say? And so I got a feeling that devoting themselves, saying, look, I don't want to spend my whole time just hearing a bunch of political stuff or hearing a bunch of ideas. I want to hear somebody that can tell me, what did Jesus say and what did he actually do? So I think that was one thing, if you got some people who love to be together to talk about the Lord and not just talk about whatever they hear from the newspaper.
Very good. Yeah, what you just said reminds me of Peter writing later, for we were eyewitnesses of these things, right? That it was an eyewitness testimony. And so it was the purest source available in the day of what Jesus said and what Jesus did. And I think it is a good reminder for us. The church can talk about many things. If your church is like mine, there's just all kinds of things going on in programs and Bible studies and things that are called Bible studies, but they're not really about the Bible. And, there's all of that. And so I think it's a good reminder that we may talk about the implications of the gospel about many practical aspects of life, and even my church is big on public theology and all of that. But the centerpiece is the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That's the gospel, the promises of God, and we can never lose that mooring in our core message. The other part of it was what we often classically we call the Didache, and that is, in addition to the Kerygma, which was the proclamation of the gospel, there was the Didache, which is the practical moral teachings of the church. And there was even a document called the Didache, written in the latter first century, which is called the Teaching of the 12 Apostles. And the thing in its entirety didn't make it into the Bible, but that it gives us a glimpse of what additionally the apostles were teaching in the moral implications of the gospel and the practices of the church that Jesus had set up in baptism and in the Lord's Supper and things like that. So this was we see that this early community, of all the things they could have been doing. I mean, think about this for a second. If Pentecost happened today and there was this dramatic spiritual religious experience, what would the next day look like? Well, you could appreciate that for some people, it would start them on a quest for religious experiences, right? Well, I want to have another jolt from heaven. I want to have another dramatic spiritual experience. But the focus of the church was not on this kind of self-absorbed pursuit of religious experiences. It was about mastering the teachings of Jesus. And that's a very different focus. Think of a church today whose main focus is a worship experience. Right. We want you to come. We want you to feel God. Right. We want you to, however we want you to respond emotionally, or, but that's the teaching's shallow. Like, I've been in these churches, right, where the teaching is kind of like youth ministry for adults. And they never really deal with hard teachings or complicated teachings or theological nuance. But they're people in pursuit of an experience. But that's not at all what the early church was about. Right. There was a cognitive component that was critical, and it was the centerpiece, and they wanted to understand, as Bill said, what Jesus said and did. I mentioned Cuba earlier. I was in Cuba a couple of decades ago as part of some doctoral work, and we were studying the history of mission in Cuba, North American missions going to Latin America. And of course, if you know much about the history of colonialism, and it's, while we did a lot of good, there are a lot of terrible things that we did as well. But we were at this Presbyterian church, and we were having a meeting with Los Jóvenes, the young people, which for them is not teenagers. It's like all the single people up into 20 or 30 or so. And we were working with these young people. And we said, what dreams do you have for your life? And people went around the circle and they shared some deeply personal things they dreamed for life. And we got to this one young woman, and she thought for a minute, and she says, I dream that one day I could be a member of this church. And I was just shocked, because in my kind of Baptist brain, I'm like, well, just accept Christ today and you can be a member of this church. But what she meant was, in her church, as a Presbyterian church in Cuba, you don't just spontaneously have a religious experience and become a member of the church. In fact, there was a minimum requirement of a year, preparation, study, understanding the teachings of Jesus, what it meant to be a follower, what it meant to be a disciple, the expectations of God, and the beauty of a life lived following Christ. And so that was aspirational for her. And it was a church that took discipleship really seriously. Many of you know that in the early days of the church, baptism was often only held once a year at Easter, and it was held after a year of discipleship that people were taught and they studied before they were actually baptized. And so that always reminds me of that there is this strong spiritual community is grounded in knowledge of the scriptures, grounded in the teachings of Jesus, rehearses them over and over again, and that we should never let go of that standard. You guys probably know about John Wesley, was famous. People used to joke that he kicked more people out of church than he brought in. And that was because John Wesley, he's all about community. Like everything I'm talking about, this is Wesleyan theology. right? That the Spirit of God shows up in small communities of people mutually committed to one another. But he was a hard man to please, and so he would travel around to all of his charges, all of his churches, and periodically, and he would evaluate every member by name. Every member by name would be evaluated, and he would visit with the local leaders, and if they weren't living up to their commitments to the church, they were out. And maybe some of you know this about John Wesley, but that's where the joke came from, that he kicked more people out of church than he brought back in. But of course, and Baptist has some of the same ideas early on because they had seen too much of an undisciplined church, people who are nominal and not truly committed. And so as they rethought community, they wanted to set a high bar. Of course, we could set that bar too high sometimes, and not, some of that's still in our DNA, and not quite be able to reach people where they are at the time. Now, the other thing I want to comment about is this devotion to the apostles' teaching. We need to remember that the faith handed down to us, this is what Paul calls it, is not necessarily a complete and static product. Now, this doesn't undermine the authority of Scripture or the truth that we've been taught, but I would suggest to you that it's incumbent for every generation to reflect on the faith that's handed down to them under the leadership of the Spirit, in community, not in isolation, and so they can respond faithfully in its own generation. And one of the reasons I say that is when I think about kind of the theological truths that get handed to us, you can think about what you were handed in your life and maybe the spiritual journey that you're on now. We realize that on the one hand, biblical truth is reliable and it's trustworthy and it has endured and it has changed lives from day one and is still changing lives today. But we also realize that Jesus started a trajectory of a loving, grace-filled, unified community, and the work wasn't completed in the pages of the New Testament. It just wasn't. It was a work in progress. And so it's reasonable to expect the church is going to do and achieve things that aren't even recorded in the Scriptures, because we're going to apply the gospel to the world we live in today. The other thing, and this is the inconvenient truth of Christianity, is that the gospel story has always been burdened by what I would call ancient bigotries that the church had to perpetually reform itself from. Just think about this. From day one all the way until today, what are some of the cultural prejudices, the bigotries, the social boundaries, the misunderstandings, the misuse of power? Like, what are some of those things that come to mind for you in the history of the church that the church at one time has felt itself very right about and later had to confess it was very wrong? What are some of those things that come to mind?
Race.
Race. Yeah, race has been, what's interesting about race, there's a lot of things, but the issue of skin color, like in the first century, didn't exist. The whole issue of skin color was something created by Western Europeans. I mean, people were just all shades of brown, right? But they cared about ethnicity and region, but they didn't really care about race. In fact, white is a social construction that was created much later. But yeah, so race has always been a problem. The church in many different ways has acted with bigotry and endorsed it, and all the way from, the early efforts of persecution of the Jews by the early church to, white nationalism at work in America today. So race has always been an issue. What else comes to mind?
Women.
Yes. Yeah, it's really, yeah. I mean, we could have, years-long conversation about the church's, misogyny and the church's lack of appreciation. I love seeing that your church, I think all the women, all the staff members are women, I think, at your church, unless I missed a few. And I've been in traditions that celebrate the giftedness of women. But yeah, the church has a long and unfortunate history about accepting and endorsing women. And even today we have, I won't get into the politics of denominations, but we have this continues to be a problem. What else?
The big one, sexual orientation.
Sexual orientation, and I won't go too deep into that because I know you guys are living in it, but that's been something from the very beginning, right? That the church has taken an adverse stand toward. So that's a big issue. What else? Bill?
I guess you could call it exclusivity from the standpoint of discipline. You know, we talked about Baptists and Methodists trying to have a little more, maybe the word pure is heavy, a little more pure group of Christians. But I think sometimes it's gone way beyond Wesley. It's gone to the point of where the uppity up and the superpower leaders become dictators and begin to force people, and Christianity, not in their modern day as much, but in the history of Christianity, we've struggled terribly with the large denominations setting rules. And if people didn't keep those rules, that now that we look back on it, they were not scriptural. They were just people trying to make money. So I think our approach with money has been a real problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Money, and really, Bill, you introduced the idea of power and all the ways the church has misused its power. And if it was a bigotry, it would be a bigotry against people who had none, right? And an eagerness of the church to use whatever power it had to victimize people without power, or to use them, or to whatever. I won't go too far down this road, but since I mentioned the idea of colonialism and mission, my friend Robert P. Jones, who founded the Public Religion Research Institute, and he's had a series of books out about race issues and white supremacy and some other things. I was recently with him, and he was pointing out about the doctrine of discovery by the Roman Catholic Church in 1493. We all know 1492, right? When Columbus sailed the ocean blue, discovered the Americas. He went back to Spain and he said to the Pope, I need a moral imperative that guides what we do with this new land. And I could say a lot about this, but the doctrine of discovery basically gave papal permission to treat all indigenous peoples as enemies of Christ. They were enemies of Christ. They were outside the gospel, and therefore they were, their lands could be taken and their property taken, and they could be enslaved, and they were non-persons. And that became the foundation for colonialism. And it's just, you know, to our modern sensibility, it is just shocking and disturbing that was the church's position. And, you know, we could say, well, those Catholics, you know, but, you know, the history of Protestant mission is infected with colonialism and cross-cultural relationships that were governed by paternalism. In fact, I did a whole doctoral project on Hispanic and Anglo relationships and white paternalism. And no matter how well-intended it is, it leverages power against people in ways that don't give them autonomy and all of that. So, yeah, I mean, so for me, it's been kind of a watershed moment to be an honest Christian and to say, historically, there have been so many good things handed to us in these teachings, but there's also been so many things we have to unlearn. And to be a reforming Christian is to say that every generation is going to discover some things. Like, I think I will pass away, and the next generation will say, you know, there's something that you didn't see. Because new life experience will open up new doors. And I think that breeds a lot of humility. Well, let's press on. So it also says they devoted themselves to fellowship. So fellowship here is that koinonia word that we most closely associate with Christian community, with their social relationships in the church. And so what we see early on is that the Spirit is producing this intense effort around the kinship and the kinship bond among what we've already seen as a radically diverse group of people. That's the real miracle, really. I mean, the miracle is that the Spirit reformed these people to break all the social boundaries that they were taught and become unified around their faith in Christ, even at great loss to themselves. Many of them lost their own family members. They couldn't buy property. They lost jobs. I mean, there was a lot of, as the persecution mounted against Christians. But they provided this day by day commitment to the people. And I think this is just really profound, that this recovering of the notion of Christian community is intense devotion to the people, not necessarily the institution. I think, as we all know, wherever you get institutions, you get politics. It's groups of people trying to decide things. That's all politics is. It's neutral. It's not morally bad or good. It just is. But the devotion that's described here is not devotion to an institution. It's devotion to the people you saw every day, which you've already celebrated in your class, right? We were there. We go to the hospital. We take care of each other and all that. That they were devoted to the fellowship with intense effort, with the possible implication of despite difficulty. Now, this is where it gets tough, right? That we can't be romantic about this, that loving people is hard. It's hard when they won't stay the same way they were when we met them. It's hard when, we have all kinds of conflicts and differences that come up. Some people require a lot more patience than others, and it's always the other person, not you, right? So, I mean, in church, it's just when we have intimate relationships, we're going to have conflict, and there's this implication that we're going to care so much about these people that we're going to push through the difficulties, right? And that we're going to stay faithful. I think it does imply a lifelong faithfulness to people throughout all of their changes. One of the things I've been thinking about, and it started kind of in that project I told you about at my church, but I've been thinking about it longer than that. And that is to think about all the promises we make to children and young people in a church. From day one, when they're born, we make promises to them. When we devote them to the Lord, in the community of faith stands around, reads liturgies, and says, we will love and support you. When they're baptized, we make promises to them. When they're confirmed, we make promises to them. In life moments, when they graduate or they get married, we make promises to them. They're aspirational, of course, but we're sincere when we make them. But children don't stay children. They don't stay cute and adorable with simple problems, right? Children grow up to be adults. And they often, or they can, turn into people we don't expect. Their bodies may be different. Their minds may be different. Their emotional life may be different. Their politics may be different. There's so many things that can make it difficult to be faithful to the children we make promises to. And yet, will we overcome those difficulties when they make poor choices, when they develop addictions, when they push back against our traditions, and they want a little breathing room and space to live life on their own terms? You see where I'm going with this? That it's a wonderful thing when church is faithful to the promises that it makes, but it's also challenging when churches are more inclined to let a relationship languish out of disinterest, or worse yet, kick them out or put some kind of social pressure on them to get out. So when I read this, if they were devoted to the fellowship, there was this intense effort in the people that they saw day to day. And that effort was applied even when it got hard. Now, one of the things we read about, you already brought up, is this whole notion of the sharing of communal property. That in the fellowship, clearly something has happened to these people. That there's an intimacy here and an obligation here and a mutual interdependence here that far exceeds an institution, where people are actually, economically sharing all that they have and seeing that is held in common now. Now, back to my Cuba experience, this passage makes some people really nervous. Some people say, well, this sounds like socialism. This sounds like communism. What do we mean? No private property? What is this? Well, I don't think that's what the scripture is saying at all. It is saying that there's a communal economic responsibility. And I remember being in Cuba talking about some of these issues with Cuban Christians there. And they were, of course, you can imagine the culture they're steeped in, even the Christians themselves. right? But they were highly critical of North American theology and North American Christianity and the consumerism and the materialism that's so much a part of it. And it was something that, you know, we need to listen to. Because in the wealthiest country in the world, we have and a growing gap of people who are living in just abject poverty, you know, without healthcare and education, those kinds of things. I've often observed that it seems like an odd thing that we will do charity work. We will serve people and their immediate needs, but we won't address the social political systems that keep those people in poverty. It's just I was a member of a former church. Anyway, it was just so disturbing to me that they would pretend to do cross-cultural ministry, but all of their politics kept those people oppressed, and we're going to keep them oppressed forever. And no one really seemed to observe the discontinuity between that kind of personal charitable action and applying public theology to the problems that we have. So it's interesting, you know, we even have, you know, examples of Zacchaeus in the early Testament, in the New Testament, you know, that his response to the gospel is economic, right? It's paying back all that he's taken and even paying back more than that. And so we certainly see that the economic life of the early church was touched by the Spirit of God, and people were radically changed. All right, third, we find this description here, devoted to the breaking of bread. And someone has already mentioned that this is kind of gets a double shout out here, that this became a significant practice in the early church, and they even did so house to house, it says. What do you think was the practical benefit of this devotion to breaking of bread on a regular basis, day to day, house to house?
Get to know the people.
Sure.
Builds a community spirit.
Builds a community spirit. Absolutely.
Brad, I think it was also a public witness. Other people had to see this going on and be interested and perhaps drawn to it.
Yeah, absolutely, Ricky. I mean, yeah, there was a public witness to it. There was a public invitation, right, for people to join and participate. As people have already said, that there was this. It was miraculous evidence that the Spirit was working in the lives of these people. But just think about seeing this happen in Europe. Like, why are those people together? You know, there's no other social reason why they should be together. But now they're eating meals together. Phyllis?
That's where the stories are told.
That
When people's feet are under the same table, they tell stories. Every culture. But we missed a phrase that we didn't talk about very much, that these people witnessed some miracles and God's work. And what better place to share the stories of what they had seen and witnessed to keep this passion flamed. And in sharing the stories, we find out about the needs of those around the table. So that putting your feet under the same table is an important thing for families and for larger communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for pointing that out. I mean, it was a structural element to their pattern of life that enabled all these things to happen, right? All this conversation, all this reflection on what all this meant, storytelling for how they were being changed. As Ricky said, the concern for the people around them and a way to welcome. It was an on-ramp, right? A way to welcome people into the community that was safe and that was hospitable and it was friendly. You know, when you think about Jesus and mealtimes, we all know, you know, mealtimes were very spiritually significant in a variety of ways for Jesus. It was a time of fellowship. It was a time of revelation. You know, things were revealed around meals. Sometimes it was a time of controversy, right? Judas's, you know, conflicts around the Last Supper. Things happened at dinner, and things still happen at dinner. There's a vehicle for grace and to challenge the social boundaries, And when you think about it theologically, I mean, and it really, our table fellowship really is it's kind of a foreshadowing of the Messianic banquet, right? One day we are all going to sit at the table of the Lord together with the Lord, with all people the Lord invites. And if we don't want to have dinner with certain people today, we're not going to want to have dinner then. I often tell people, you know, heaven's going to surprise you more than you think. Bill, what are you going to say?
I was going to say that I think small groups always feet under the table or not, small groups help people no longer be marginalized. I mean, I can't see many of these people who are uneducated, don't look too good, sound kind of weird, and are ashamed of their background. I can't see them standing up in a crowd of 500 and sticking their hand up and say, I got a question I want to ask. They're just not going to do it. That's why not only, that's why some of us think that the New Testament grew so fast, was because they were mostly small groups of people who could ask questions and share their testimonies. Maybe that's what we need more. I know this class is here is Phyllis and I's church. And that's so critical. And I think that's the reason Baptists and Methodists have been one of the fastest growing denominations in the history of American Protestantism, is because they emphasize small groups.
Absolutely. You know, I think I've learned more about people outside of church than in. I mean, that's where you learn it. In that casual, unstructured downtime.
Amen.
Around a cup of coffee, a back porch, Bill and Phyllis. We had a lot of back porch conversations early on in our relationship that really created that intimacy, right? And we need to give that to other people. You know, I love that you shared in the very beginning that, you know, we're really fortunate in Voyagers because it's taken 25 years, but we developed this kind of community. And my response to you was, well, you got a lot to give, right? There are so many people out there that need your fellowship, right? That need your welcome, your acceptance, that need to be invited to dinner, that need you to hear their story lovingly and supportively. And I know COVID and everything else has, you know, created a hitch in a lot of things, but I'm reminded about that we just cannot let life become so busy and so full of other things that we don't leave space for this. Phyllis.
Another fringe benefit of the community is accountability and encouragement. As you share things, if you want to make changes in your life, sometimes it's pretty difficult to do it by yourself, but when you tell your friends, you know, this is what I'm going through and this is what I'm going to do about it, you kind of become accountable for making changes in your life. And you have people that are behind you that encourage you to do those changes.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. Phyllis, just a second. I'm just going to add, because you made me, as you were talking, sir, you made me think about how oftentimes I need to say to someone something like, you know, I was so stupid last week. It's, you know, it's a casual way of confessing my sins, right? And my mind, my soul wants to get it out, right? And nothing like a smug group of friends to say, you know what? And I did this thing, and I said this thing, and made a joke about this thing, and I shouldn't have, and, you know, and yeah, I mean, casual conversation helps us really cleanse our souls and be accountable. Phyllis, what were you going to say?
I was just wondering, since Phil Calhoun is with us this morning. Phil, I hope you're still there. He lives in a different place with a different sense of community. And I was just wondering, Phil, I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you have a comment since your experience is different from our experience?
Thank you.
Okay.
Still there, he just needs to unmute.
He needs to unmute himself, Phyllis.
Yeah, well, Philip, you come back in later if you want to.
He's on
That's fine.
mute. So he said he was a little technologically challenged, but I'm sure he would have something very interesting to say.
I'm sure he would. Yeah. And it's
Brad,
yes.
I have to say before your time runs out here, that maybe next week you can tell us more about this, but talking about fellowship, I'll tell you this much. When Brad was just a young fella working in the business world, struggling with a sense of whether I'm called or not, Brad took Phyllis and me on a camping trip. We put our feet under the camping table and talked about it and wondered and heard Brad struggle with it, but was in that context and being alone and be able to talk together. He went off and had a real unusual kind of experience that he might want to share with us sometime. But I just think that idea that just made the whole thing of Jesus being gone and people wanting to know when they get together. I think this class is a tremendous example of that's all that getting together that we do. And Brad, I just think it's probably a bigger critical element of growing congregations than those who just sit around and study.
For sure. Yeah. And the people who are the connectors in a congregation, who connect one person with another, I mean, God bless them, right? Because that's the most foundational work of the church. Yeah, well, we are running out of time. So Bill, thanks for pointing out. We were going to talk about prayer, but we won't touch on that today. I will say this, I've been studying your website for your church at Boerne. One of the things I did in this exercise with my church was we had just revamped a website. And so I brought up some of the aspirational statements that churches use just to remind us, right? And I think you have some great stuff on your website. So, when you think about your church's mission and vision, right? It says, we are invited and we invite others to encounter the transforming love of God, to gather as one body and experience God's presence in this time and place, in one another and in ourselves. I think that's beautiful. I mean, I think that embodies what we are talking about. We are a community. And we want to welcome people into that community because we experience God in one another and in ourselves. You have another page called I'm New. If you click on the I'm New button of your website for the new folks, it says, welcome home. We are an accepting church family being transformed by encounters with God's love, growing in faith and serving it all. I love that. We are an accepting church family. And I think if you think, reflect on what does that look like if we are an accepting church family to everybody, what does that look like? And as my church has been thinking a lot about, how might we have to change in order to be a truly accepting body and to be a church family to them? One of the transitions we're going through is that we're a predominantly white congregation, and we have a Black pastor now and a Black minister of music, which is kind of starting a whole new generation in the life of our church and the people who see themselves reflected in the leadership of the church. So I'll close there. Thanks for your comments this morning. I'll return next week, as I said, and we're going to talk about 3 values: solidarity, mutuality, and reconciliation, as supportive of the kind of community that we're talking about. So thanks again.
Thank you, Brad. Awesome. You said something early on that I tried to go back and write down. Something that the church is constantly reforming or constantly adjusting to meet the current. Do you have that in your notes? I'm trying to make sure I get it right.
Yeah, so I talked about the church is in constant need of reforming itself of ancient bigotries, and it's not to adjust to the current climate. Actually, what we're trying to get rid of is when the church adjusted to the past climate and arrive at a truer place.
All right, thank you. Okay, thank you. And I think that's exactly right, and so however God's timing works, your words to us these last couple of weeks, I'm sure next week, find it just perfect for the life that our church is in at the moment. And so it's just, we'll give credit to God for the timing of your words to us. And so as we do approach that, and by the way, we do have a church website. Okay, so those of you who don't spend a lot of time online, there are a lot of great things on it and stuff. And there are some things that weren't so great. That we made some changes to this past week as well. So, spend a little time there, and I think that's, as Brad mentioned, it's always great to get an outside perspective. I don't spend a lot of time there, but it's always great to hear an outside perspective, Brad, so thank you for sharing that. So we close, we thank, Philip. Philip, I think you remain in our prayers, because we know there's still challenges in front of you. Brother Charlie, battling his own, but making progress and here with us. That is the biggest thing. Brother Larry, who's working on, heart issues that we're still trying to work through. We have lots of folks traveling, as well still. So be in prayer for them as well. So, all right, without any further announcements, anybody good? Anybody good?